What if Leia Skywalker was raised on Naboo?
Unfortunately, some nobles took the opportunity to ally with the Empire. If I can save 1 billion lives by killing one man, I'll gladly pull the trigger.
Even Sith don't murder random people.
You're missing the point.
He's a Sith! Kill him!
Now, really, is that any way to treat your family?
I'm not a Sith. Don't let him turn you against me. We can defeat him. Together.
What would happen if the daughter to Padme lived with her aunt? What if the Naboo family intervened after Polis Massa? And what now? Having never met one another in George's timeline, and never knowing about Polis Massa, only the knowledge of Ruth Thul is ever implied, the same knowledge that led Grand Inquisitor Malorum to interrogate and question her. With much of Luke and Leia's time upon that isolated hospital, lost to the ages, none amongst galactic history searched harder than Malorum, seeking to both ingratiate himself to Darth Vader while also holding such information above his head. One of the few that knew about Darth Vader's true identity as Anakin Skywalker, yet refusing to openly tell, probably for the best, his repeated attempts to learn more about Skywalker is what led to this investigation. Convinced without evidence that Padme was treated on Polis Massa, his two sources of information were enough to solidify his opinion. The databanks and records given to him by Sancor, but also the newly learned fact that Padme's body was brought to Naboo by an unnamed Jedi. Glossing over the covered-up death of Sancor and the implication that if he survived with the records he stole, Luke and Leia would have been discovered, the more important fact to follow is the resolve that fueled the Grand Inquisitor, eventually leading himself to torment the grandmother of Padme. His reasoning to target her was pre-planned and forecasted, knowing well that since Ruth Thul was the one who directed and led Padme's funeral, she herself should know the most. And yet, even though this elderly woman was frail and fragile, her will was akin to stone, unbreakable and unflinching, especially when she was confronted at the very place she felt most secure, Varakino, the island where Padme and Anakin were married, going on to openly deny any knowledge about the survival of her own great-grandchildren. Even if she did know, she wouldn't tell. However, one could say that the panic she oozed after Malorum came to such a conclusion was enough to vindicate him. While reading the novel, one might come to the idea that Obi-Wan Kenobi was the unnamed Jedi that brought Padme's corpse to Naboo. Going further off of this plot point, the assumption is that Obi-Wan told Ruth Thul about the survival of Luke and Leia. All of this context combined allows us to jump back to the past and address the first major change in our timeline. This specific debate, both during the movie and the novelization for Episode 3, a moment that I personally have never fully agreed with. What I mean is, the rush that Bail Organa is in towards adopting a young baby Leia is, in my opinion, deeply concerning when combined with the disgustingly inappropriate implications made during Star Wars Tales 11. While I will not openly call Bail Organa the word that we're all thinking, he clapped and cheered when a preteen Leia dressed up like a Twi'lek slave girl, and in my own humble opinion, I would rather exclude him from the storyline whenever it is convenient. Because of this, let's say, following the implications made from the Death on Naboo novel, Obi-Wan was indeed the Jedi that brought Padme to her home planet. More than that, he also brought both Luke and Leia with him to her funeral, providing closure not for them, but himself, as he too still mourned not just the loss of a friend and brother, but the Jedi Order he once called his. But still, the sight that greeted him was almost too heavy to bear, crushed not just by the emotional weight of thousands parading in sadness and turmoil, but also the family that came afterwards. Aristocrats, honored and esteemed, even now in their deepest hour of sorrow. Continuing off the assumption that Obi-Wan would openly reveal the truth about Luke and Leia to the family they descended from, the following confrontation would be verbally fierce and edged, debating as if they were inside the Galactic Senate House itself. Thankfully obscured and hidden well in the mansion they called theirs, none around could be nosy enough to hear or watch, leaving alone the Jedi that bore such an assault, filled with nothing but remorse. Not for telling the parents before him that which they deserved to know, but remorse for failing the student he loved like family. Having already told Grand Master Yoda of his decision to live in exile on Tatooine, and making such a declaration now as well, stating his desire to take Luke and Leia with him to hide from the Empire. All those were haunted by one single question afterwards, forever denied but always implied. Who was the father? If the words of Ru Thul herself are to be held at any value, even she never knew, and in fact, she never asked. While they did know Padme was pregnant, the Clone Wars kept her away from Naboo for several months by the time of her death, sinking deeper into the lore and pulling revelations from the Dark Lord Rise of Darth Vader novel. Obi-Wan, at this point, would still believe his student to be dead, encouraging him to state and say all about his fallen Padawan, revealing the love that Anakin Skywalker shared with Padme, but more than that, he focused on his fall to the dark side, proclaimed dead and deemed to never return again, while his twin children remained. There and then, Sola would ponder the very conversation she once shared with her sister during the novelization for Episode 2, and the idea that she should settle down and get married with children. An idea that Padme would, even if she didn't admit it at the time in that novel, deeply agree with, going on to marry the love of her life, Anakin Skywalker. Once nothing but a random encounter off of Tatooine, then her bodyguard, and finally, her lover. Burdened by these concepts, the sight of Leia would only strengthen the trauma and turmoil that they brought, reminded of the younger sister she once cared for during their childhood, promptly speaking her belief that both of these children should be left with family to be guided, nurtured, and raised. The Jedi Master that bore such a request was hesitant, already denying such advances earlier, but now finding it much more difficult, only relenting halfway when both Sola and Ru promised to forever raise and house the girl they sought on Veracino. The grandfather himself wanted the boy, but knew best of the danger it would attract. If Anakin was dead, if their father was gone, then surely one simple girl, living privately under the Nayberry house, wouldn't garnish too much attention, and even then, The cautionary placement of Luke beside Obi-Wan gave them clarity that at least one of their grandchildren were safe. From here, the departure of Jedi Master Obi-Wan from the planet would be followed by yet another change to our timeline, except several months ahead, when the fated confrontation with Malorum would finally erupt on Naboo. Meeting not just Rue, but Leia also in toddler form, the death of the former and kidnapping of the latter left shockwaves across Ferrus Olin, settled only when he finally managed to catch up and duel his foe. Fighting in the same reactor room that Master Jin, Darth Maul, and Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi battled inside, the loss of balance that affected the Grand Inquisitor when he leapt for safety was what brought his very end. Plummeting into the voided abyss here, just like he did in George's timeline, the following series of novels would proceed as normal, with the obvious exception that, instead of returning to Alderaan, Ferrus would return to Naboo. Glossing over his dispatched assignments as a double agent and focusing solely on the domestic aspect of his life, his role would remain unknown, seen and spotted only on the most dangerous of outings and emergencies. With Ferrus trustworthy enough for the spirit of Master Jin to personally plead and beseech for his exiled student to aid him, so too would the Nayberry family trust him enough in our timeline to gift him with unquestioned access. Going off the assumption that the Darth Vader and the Lost Command comics take place several weeks after his fall, one implication can be made from such knowledge: the fact that he never, not once, fully stopped loving Padme. Holding this fact to our heart, the next change in our storyline will be the combination of yet another story tying into this one. Most of them either focus on his first few years as a Dark Lord or his time during the rebellion. To my knowledge, the number of novels, comics, and games that depict Darth Vader between 17 BBY and 7 BBY could be counted with one hand. And even things that he should be present for, like the Camino Uprising, the orbital bombardment of Durelion, and the desiccation of Calandrian B, unfold without any mention of his presence. Because of this, let's say that in our timeline, the events of Star Wars Tales 1 and 2, Extinction, would take place 10 years early, with the only thing needing to be addressed is Mara Jade, with herself being too young to be the Emperor's hand in 10 BBY, replacing Mara with the Grand Inquisitor Hydra and dispatching Darth Vader to confront the Dark Woman, just like he originally did. The rest of these comics will remain the same, but their outcome will shatter the Dark Lord that bears them. Teased and tormented as the Dark Woman, her true name was already spoken and known, not to her foe, but the boy he once was. The name of Jedi Master Anya Kuro, living on Kopirigan 5 in her second exile for what would be, in our timeline, 10 years. Speaking the same words she originally did, reminding Darth Vader of what can be reclaimed and redeemed if one strove hard enough, the Dark Lord would retort that she also should understand that once a dark path is taken, there is no going back. Of course, in this moment, in this confrontation, the fallen Jedi Anakin Skywalker was referring to Aurora Singh and the failure of her master, even though still the first attack of this battle came not from the Jedi Defender, but the Sith behind her. Skipping past their battle and focusing on the death of Anya Kuro, the Dark Lord raised his blade, seeking the final strike of satisfaction, denied as the body in front of him had already vanished, faded, and gone from reality. In this moment, in this timeline, this would be the first instance of Darth Vader seeing someone after their own death, since Obi-Wan Kenobi hasn't died at this point, and Master Jin was never able to physically appear to him, only speak, like in the Rogue Planet novel, the novelization for Episode 2, and the movie itself. Because of this, the silence that struck Darth Vader was interrupted only by the ever-humming respiration of his life support system, momentarily disturbed when he struck out and slashed the ghost in front of him, yet remaining silent when nothing happened. And the following statement from Jedi Master Anya Kuro would go on to haunt Darth Vader, just like in George's timeline, openly referring to him as Skywalker in the re-released comic, while calling him Anakin directly in the original edition. It was in this moment that the Dark Lord realized how correct his foe actually was, and the realization that the light side really was strong. Tying back into the previously mentioned comic, Darth Vader and the Lost Command. All of this combined would allow us to address the next major change in this story, the return of Darth Vader towards the very place he never wanted to go. Not Tatooine, a planet hounded by its own problems from the past, but Naboo, a constant reminder of what could have been, delaying his report to the Emperor and going out of his way to deny or postpone any attempt to call his holo communicator. The slaughtering of his stormtrooper escort gave him privacy as his thoughts focused only on Padme. Never far gone from his mind, and indeed constantly plagued by nightmarish visions whenever he slept, she alone was his only comfort. A comfort that, in George's original timeline, the Dark Lord managed to ignore for almost 20 years. But not here in our timeline. With the year being 10 BBY, and the date itself being the birthday of Padme Amidala, and with Darth Vader scarred by the past, his journey through hyperspace felt like years, thinking long thoughts from days even longer gone. Too late in the evening, after entering orbit, for anyone to notice his descent towards the cobblestone streets of Theed, rays of moonlight baked the land, with none in the adjacent spaceport dare questioning the clearance of his Imperial vessel. Knowing well where Padme's place of rest was, but always denying himself the privilege or curiosity to seek it, the anxiety he felt now was muffled by his breathing, landing his ship nearest the riverway before disembarking as quickly as his robotic legs would allow. Only then and there would he finally glimpse the stained glass portrait of the very woman he dreamt of every day since her fall, nearly buckling in both mind and body as his life support system was strained by his prolonged gasping. All of this was ended in an instant when, springing high over the outstretched tomb, the carried gaze of Leia Skywalker spun to meet him, having snuck out from Varakino to visit her mother's grave, always denied by her aunt and always told to hide. Having interacted only with people she could trust, surely to anyone else, the imposing Dark Lord before her would have warranted concern, especially since, in this timeline, Ferris Olin would not be training her as a Jedi, only watching over her like he originally did. This is partially because the idea of Leia Skywalker being trained since birth as a Jedi could, by itself, be its own video. But mainly, it's because in this story, in this precise moment, Anakin Skywalker would be reborn. Met not by a Jedi child trained to hate him, or rebel soldiers that shot to ambush him. The proclamation from the girl in front would shatter his mind, with Leia herself skipping up to the Dark Lord before gripping his metallic hand. 9 years old at this point in our timeline, she knew enough to notice when someone was visiting her mother's tomb to pay respect. Also knowing well that she too was the direct daughter of Padme and Anakin. Having never left Veracino until this point, she never had any reason to hide her identity or lineage before, and she didn't start now. Speaking aloud, that as the daughter to Padme, she was thankful anytime someone remembered her mother. Going further, in an attempt to learn that which her aunt and guardian hadn't told her, her next line of questions were simple, asking the darkened figure beside her if he knew her mother, if he loved her mother, and if he himself had any stories about her to tell. This, combined with the previously mentioned hesitation instilled by Anya Kuro, would finally kill Darth Vader, slaughtered within the span of seconds, as his only response was to drop upon his knees before taking hold and embracing his long-lost daughter.